Hey all, Jason Levon, priest at St. Luke's Episcopal Church in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and welcome to another edition of Pause and Pray. Today I find myself steeped in a beautiful and holy and formative memory of mine. It came about 14 years ago, shortly before I was ordained to the priesthood in the Roman Catholic Church. And I had this experience of extreme trepidation. It wasn't cold feet. I had felt called to the priesthood, but as I was nearing ordination, I had this trepidation because I thought that after 4 years of undergraduate work at Marquette University and 5 years of wonderful formation at St. Francis Seminary in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, that I would have a whole lot more figured out than I did. Instead, I found myself with many more questions than answers, still all sorts of struggle and doubt, not to say anything about my own personal imperfections and struggles and sinfulness and brokenness. And all of this kind of snowballed, and I found myself living in all of this tension and struggle. Now, in a moment of maturity, I decided to confide in a trusted mentor, a wise bishop who was the bishop who ordained me a deacon about 9 months earlier. And I remember this vividly. I went for a walk with him after dinner one night on the beautiful grounds of the seminary. And I confided in him about all of this going on in my heart and soul. The fact that I had so many more questions than answers, struggles and doubts and uncertainty about life and faith. And after listening attentively, the bishop got a wise grin on his face and he put his arm around me and he said, "Jason, I think your formation has done its job. Because if you thought you had all of the answers and had it all together, I'd be worried about the kind of minister you would be to God's people." He said, "Here's the thing. It's not about you. It's about God and God's grace, which is why we call it a gift. And here's the other thing. God wants to use all of you, even and especially all of your imperfections, your questions, your struggles and doubts, through which to minister to you and to God's people." There's a lot of wisdom in that memory, and it's wisdom I'm continuing to mine to this day, nearly 14 years into my ministry, because I've had to come back to that and learn from it over and over again. I find myself steeped in that memory in part because of the second reading today's daily office brings to us. It comes from the second letter of Paul to the Corinthians, where Paul is reflecting on this mystery he reflects on in many ways throughout his writings. Namely that it's his own fragility and weakness that only allows God's gospel to work more effectively through him. His language in today's second reading is that he and all of us hold this wonderful treasure of light and life, but we hold it in clay vessels, because that's what we truly are, clay vessels. And as clay, we're all fragile. There's a deep fragility in clay. And yet for Paul, that becomes the precise means through which God's light and love and grace is able to spill into our lives and out of our lives. It's our fragility then that becomes a gift. And that's invited me to pause and to pray today about all the ways in which I've experienced fragility becoming a gift in my life, moving me to connect more deeply with others and ultimately with God, and in that connection finding God's light and grace wanting to spill into and out of my life. I can also name plenty of times where I thought I had it all together or tried to have it all together, and in those cases I was a wonderful barrier to God's grace and light and life. And I invite you all to pause and to pray about the same, in the hopes that we all come to a deeper appreciation for our fragility and what it opens our lives to, the vessels it allows us to become. After all, isn't that the wisdom of support groups? That it's a shared fragility that not only draws a group of people together, but also becomes the very means of grace and a source of strength and hope and guidance and healing as people try to live with that fragility. Or maybe it's what we're all experiencing collectively as a world today, as this pandemic has exposed a global fragility And yet in all of that fragility, we find ourselves recognizing just how deeply connected each and every one of us is to each other. Ultimately, it's our fragility that leads us to want to connect more deeply with one another and ultimately with God. It's our fragility that transforms us into vessels for God's love and light and peace and grace to spill into and out of. God's peace and blessings to you all.